Hello, everybody. I'm Rob Tierney, and this is the first of a series of lectures about the history of reading research or literacy research. I begin with the period 1850 to 1950, which I call the foundational period. You'll find references, by the way, to some of the people that I talk about in my presentation in your reading list. But thank you. I look forward to moving. I chose the period 1850 to 1950 primarily because I was sort of interested in sort of tracing back as far as I thought needed to be where some of the predominant tendencies in the reading research field emanated. And I found myself believing that the primary root was the establishment of the discipline of psychology, which occurred in the between 1850 and 1900 in Europe. And with the establishment of psychology, initially at least, and I think still to this day, there was a strong emphasis on psychology aspiring to be a science in the traditional sense, doing work that was measurable, objective, and to an extent, at least initially, and I'd say even to this day, heavily influenced by what might be considered behavioristic tendencies. And during this period of psychology, you also saw developments that I will be talking more about, of the establishment of the first tests of ability, first tests of intelligence, first test of reading. And so in conjunction with this sort of objectivity, this observable, measurable approach to looking at the world, testing emerged as having a strong presence, which perpetuated, at least I'd say up and through the 1940s, a strong emphasis upon correlational studies, where they'd look at the relationship between variables that they could measure in hopes of finding out what types of things might actually contribute to changes in different sorts of behavior. So if I was to talk about the initial period, 1850 to 1950, I would sort of say they had these tendencies. There was certainly a behavioral tendency, and associated with aspiring to be a science in a traditional sense, a heavy interest in objectivity, observable phenomenon, and I would distinguish observable phenomenon from speculations based upon, for example, introspection, and also in conjunction with testing, a heavy emphasis on measurement and correlations between things that were measurable. In reality, if you look at you can sort of see the traces of these development when you actually understand the lineage of the key players at this point in time. The person who is considered to be the father of psychology was a German by the name of Wilhelm Wundt. I think I'm pronouncing it correctly. And he, together with an American person who's also considered to be the father of American psychology, wrote the first textbook on psychology, William James, who's also considered by some people as a philosopher of note. William James, by the way, was trained as a physician. But Wundt established the first psychology lab at the University of Leipzig, and James was at Harvard University. You begin to understand how psychology grew and how reading grew hand in hand with that when you begin to understand that one of the phenomena that psychologists were really interested in studying, which they believed to be observable and relatively easy to look at objectively, I would differ on that today, was the act of reading. And you had a number of people who were doing early experiments looking at things like eye movements, speed of reading, and other things, and trying to correlate these. Working with William Wundt was sort of like the who's who of psychology, but also in some sense the who's who of the reading field. One person was a fellow by the name of Cattell, and if you look at his students, you have Arthur Gates, who, according to many people, is considered one of the leading pioneers in the field of reading, and several clinicians who were doing a lot of work in diagnosis. Guy Bond and another fellow by the name of Tinker, Ruth Strang, and an English scholar, Margaret Mead. And also coming out of his lab was another person, Judd, who established the first psychology lab at Yale University, which for many years had been a sort of a hotbed of psychological analyses, particularly focused on reading. About the same period in the States, you have William James, again a philosopher, trained as a physician, but quite a sort of a Renaissance person in terms of the areas of interest and the students he worked with. The person of most note relative to psychology, the first in one some people consider to be the most dominant experimental psychologies through the 1880s till about the 1940s, was E.L. Thorndike. He had a son who also was a very famous psychologist, Robert Thorndike, but E.L. Thorndike, most people would consider to be the father of educational psychology, at least. And another person who worked with William James was John Dewey, probably the foremost educational philosopher of the last century, whose impact not only in the US but globally has been huge. And yet another person, G. Stanley Hall. And G. Stanley Hall had two amazing students of note. One was a guy by the name of Edmund Huey, and I can't remember this person's first name, but a developmental psychologist by the name of Gesell. What's very important to realize is that these psychologists, educational psychologists, dominated reading research, and indeed I'd say the domination of psychologists in terms of reading research persisted at least through the 1970s. And initially were very much tied to looking at reading in a relatively narrow sort of fashion at the word and letter level, initially through eye movements, by looking for things that were measurable. What's interesting is if you look at the very first textbook on reading, a book was written by Edmund Huey, came out in 1908. It's called The Psychology and Pedagogy of Reading. So you can sort of see the influence of these particular people. Judd, who I said was also a student of William Wundt, one of his students was a very famous reading scholar who was responsible for some of the most important studies in reading. It was a fellow by the name of William S. Gray. He was also responsible for the development of Scott Forsman readers, Dick and Jane. But he was, again, a student of Judd. And interestingly, he actually developed the first reading test. And you can start to sort of see how these things were offshoots of each other. E.L. Thorndike, by the way, was very much involved in developing entrance exams for university, and which have a sort of a mixed history, by the way. because some of these entrance exams back in the early 1900s were predominantly being developed to discriminate against students. Reading has a mixed history, particularly when it comes to testing, because reading, as you probably know, has also been caught up with issues of voting rights and certainly has been an integral part of the sort of the gatekeeping. The initial work on testing entrance exam stuff that Thorndike and his colleagues did was alleged to be an attempt to actually reduce the number of Jewish students that would be acceptable into some of the elite universities. And then around this same time, you've got this one, you've got this happening in about 1906, Huey's work happening in about 1908, and this happening in around 1910. And you've also got the development, I think, of the Stanford-Binet, the tests of intelligence that were used. And so you can start to sort of see how, emerging from this period, it's so easy to make the move into correlational studies, where you could actually correlate, for example, a person's intelligence with their reading test performance, and maybe even suggest that certain people of a mental age, or that people had to reach a certain mental age before they could learn to read. And so we had the beginnings of correlational studies being used to, unfortunately, make educational decisions, where they looked to see which things were highly correlated with other things, and then they worked those into curriculum. One of the most classic ones was alphabetic knowledge. Alphabet knowledge has always been a great predictor of early reading success, and sure enough, what did that perpetuate? A lot of curriculum focused on teaching kids the alphabet. Usually didn't give those kids an advantage, because most of us believe now that probably the reason why alphabet knowledge correlates so much with early reading success has more to do with their fuller literacy experiences, often provided by parents who in better economic situation. But you can. I hope you get a sense of the antecedents. Indeed, you still see traces today. You still see some other interesting tendencies being perpetuated with respect to how reading's approached. You see, coming out of this reading period, you saw the establishment of the concept of reading readiness. And you see still in our schools today a huge emphasis on materials that are supposed to make kids ready for reading. There are yet other traces. I've already mentioned the emphasis upon vocabulary. You had developing with these concepts of reading readiness and the reading test, also the beginnings of this concept of readability. Could people actually pin down what level of reading is required to read different materials? And initially there was one formula developed. Thorndike was involved in one, as was some other people. I think right now we've got readability formulas in the hundreds. In terms of reading tests, by the way, I just sort of brought along this massive volume, which is one of several volumes, summarizing, I think, about 500 or 600, and I suspect there are thousands of tests out there now for different subject areas, and particularly a large number focused on reading. Now, at the same time as these developments were going on, you did have some people challenging some of these concepts. One person in particular who I mentioned is a person whose work I always have appreciated is Frederick Bartlett, who was a professor at Cambridge, a social psychologist primarily, who wrote a wonderful book on remembering, arguing that readers or people making meaning are really creating meanings for themselves based upon their background experience, or schema, as he referred to it. Interestingly, people did not gravitate to that sort of thinking. People were much more interested in viewing reading, from my perspective, as an act of reception, not an act of creating meaning, but an act of actually reading in response to the text, where a person was expected first to develop a literal understanding of the text before they engaged in interpretation or inferential thinking. Bartlett's work, which came up and much, much later, was being highlighted. His book came out, I think, in 1932, but it was largely ignored until in the 1970s. Indeed, in the 30s and 40s, I suspect his work was hardly cited at all. In the 1970s, I would suspect his book, Remembering, was one of the most cited books in the educational psychology literature. Okay. Let me take a move to the next section then, and talk a little bit more about how these ideas segued into developments that occurred in the 30s and 40s and leading to the 50s and 60s.